Thank you very much. Very happy to be here for like a bit different from everything else today and yesterday. Here we are. So full disclosure, my background is computational biology, so anything I point out saying it has a big carbon footprint, I've probably done way worse before. And I don't really need this slide here today saying high-performance computing achieved amazing things, not only in health data science, but that as well. Including in fighting climate change. There are lots of opportunities there, making electricity grids more efficient and so on. Where it gets interesting is that obviously this also comes at a cost. I quite like this report from EMBL, the European Life Science Laboratory, where they found that it was around 65 tons of CO2 per publication in the year. For reference, the IPCC target is around 2 tons per person and per year to keep global warming under control. They found it was around 30 tons per scientist as well. So quite big numbers. If we look at data centers are around 100 megaton of CO2 equivalent per year. That's the same as the American commercial aviation. In the UK, it's about 4% of the total electricity usage. Now, the analysis we do, I just handpicked an example. GWAS stands for Genome-Wide Association Study. Doesn't matter if you're not familiar. Every time you read a paper that says we found the gene for X, that's probably what happened. And doing it, for example, in UK Biobank, for 1,000 traits, we can get a carbon footprint of about up to 17 tons. I could fly to Paris for breakfast every morning and fly back to the office every day for 6 months with that. So, yeah, not great. Doesn't mean all analyses are like that. Some of them have very small carbon footprint. And the wide range, the main thing is we don't need to overthink every single keystroke and be completely paranoid about all the compute we do. But the fact that some analyses have such a large carbon footprint probably says that we need to think about it a little bit. We talked a lot about large language models and ChatGPT. There aren't any data about ChatGPT because not too much transparency. But for example here, GPT-3 is like the ancestor of ChatGPT. Around over 500 tons of CO2 to train the model once. And you know, it never gets trained once. You get 3.5 and then 4 and 4.5 and then they try to beat it and it doesn't work and so on. Okay, and the important thing here is it doesn't mean we shouldn't do science. There are lots of synergies and lots of ways we can make better science and also more sustainable science. And that's what motivated putting together these greener principles for sustainable computing with lots of people of HDR UK involved and trying to bring in different stakeholders. Because it's science, we had to find a good acronym for it. But ChatGPT didn't exist, so it was a lot of hard work to actually make it work. I'm really annoyed now. And I'll just work that as a framework to walk through the rest of this presentation. So the first two, governance and responsibility. The idea is who can make a difference and who has a role to play. And that's going to be incredibly boring. The answer to that is everyone. If we try to group it a little bit, when it comes to sustainability and like many other aspects of science, grassroots movements have an absolutely key role to play. Early career researchers, lab technicians, RSCs, and so on. And that's really important. The only problem is at some point we start hitting a ceiling and there's only so much change you can actually enforce in your institutions. And that's where we need actual top-down support as well to have research institutes, funders, PIs, head of institutions to also engage in this process. And at the end, we have industry, because especially when it comes to compute, so much of the research we do is intertwined with industry, either in terms of applications or in terms of using cloud compute. And it's not always the easier to convince, but lots of massive role to play from them as well. Speaking of that, just poking this green algorithm certification on which we're working. It's some kind of certification, a bit like the Athenis one for EDI, but for dry labs. The same thing exists for wet labs, and so we've been piloting over the past years. It's been really successful, and so now we're hoping to release that soon. So if you're interested, do get in touch. And another thing is environmental impact statement. So that's something I've been rambling about for years and saying, well, we should do that in grants and say, you know, if we make the case for £1 million, we should be able to make the case for 1 million tons of CO2 as well. And the answer was usually, well, we can't really do it. So I was really happy when the French government got in touch. So apologies for the slides in French, but you know, the French people can't really speak English. And they said that's a 40 million euros over 5 years funding call. They basically fund AI for local communities to make local communities more sustainable. They required that every single applications for AI projects had to include a statement quantifying the carbon carbon footprint of their research using our calculator, which was quite nice. And the great conclusion of that is it didn't break science. Because there was 40 million euros on the table, so people spent a couple hours estimating their carbon footprint. They didn't decide that, oh, well, no, I'm not applying for the money anymore because, they asked me about sustainability. And so that's such a brilliant case study of saying, there was lots of lessons from that and things we could do better and make it easier, but fundamentally, people understand why it's being asked, and so it just works. Okay, now, estimating and reporting. So how do we do it in practice? How to quantify carbon footprint? There are lots of ways. I only have 10 minutes, so I'm not going to cover everything. But there are three main aspects of computing in general. The first one is powering the computer, and that's probably what you're thinking about, kind of getting the electricity and the carbon footprint of electricity production. But the other two are long-term data storage, and I mean, everyone in the room will be aware that sometimes that's where the impact is, and actually the compute is not, it's quite simple, logistic regression, for example, but the data is enormous data. And then what is not enough talked about is life cycle footprint. So that means including manufacturing of the hardware, using it for its entire lifetime, but then disposing of it as well. And if you take your phone or your tablet, 70 to 90% of their impact is only from manufacturing. So for these devices, for example, that's an important part. So that's the kind of things we're working on at the moment. I'm just going to plug that because it's kind of a very quick summary of the different tools available for carbon footprint estimation. So if you're interested, you can check this out. But the first tool we released, and that was early 2020, we were wondering about the carbon footprint of what we do in bioinformatics. Turns out there was no tool, so this 2 weeks project turns out into, 4 years and going. But so we created this online calculator. It's really straightforward. You go on there, you say my model runs for that long using that kind of resources, and it gives you an estimate of carbon footprint. Turned out to be quite successful. People really liked it. It's simple. It's all open data. All the data is open source on GitHub. It works quite well. But the problem of an online calculator is you run your job 100 times with different parameters, it becomes a bit annoying. So I thought, oh, that would be brilliant if I could go on the data center and just say, what is my carbon footprint for the past 6 months? And it was either doing it or writing my PhD thesis. So as you can see, the tool exists. And it's quite straightforward. It pulls the logs because on the data center, everything you do is being tracked. So it pulls the logs and it estimates carbon footprint. It gives you metrics. It's quite small, but basically you can see the impact of failed jobs. That's depressing. Or the resources that are not efficiently used. But that's good information. The problem is it's not pretty. So we're like, OK, how can we make it pretty? And that's great for individual researchers, but then we can also track institutions, and you can have research groups, and you can monitor over time and see what's going wrong. And so that's this idea of institutional dashboard where you can feed back information to individual users, and that's really important because that's how you change behaviors. Publishing the annual carbon footprint of the University of Cambridge is great. No one will change their behavior based on that because everyone thinks they're just a tiny piece in this enormous machine. But also being able to individual data, but also aggregated data. And so working with our method and working with EBI, they did a bit of a test for their very specific data center. So they put together this brilliant dashboard. Lots of interesting case studies came out of it. And now we're like, well, if we could offer that everyone open source as a plug-and-play solutions for smaller institutions that don't have the resources to develop it in-house, let's do it. And that's basically what we're working on at the moment. So again, any interest in that, either because you have it or you want it, do get in touch. And as another application, because we have a lot of biologists here, Nextflow is we heard about Elixir earlier, and so Nextflow is also a pipeline, does pipeline management. I don't really use it myself, but what they did is they implemented our green algorithm method as a plugin, and now people who run it can, just by activating one option, know the carbon footprint of the pipeline run, which is also really interesting, so really great work from these. Okay, so we went from, it's great to quantify, but then we want to reduce carbon footprint at some point. And a lot of it comes down to having qualified RSCs, for example, or doing better code. And I'm not going to go into the details, but it's a bit old. It's 2 years old, but the main principles apply from this we put together with some colleagues. 2 points I want to stop on. It's the way the Royal Society phrased it, and I quite like it, is to say that the research we do, so they say for net zero, I would argue for probably anything, needs to be energy proportionate. And I think it's a good way to phrase it. It's hard to quantify the potential benefits, but it's hard to quantify the benefits when we ask for money in a grant as well, but we find a way. So probably we should be able to do the same thing. And when we talk about cost benefit, it's actually harder because the population who benefit the most who benefit the least from a technology like the latest generation of Apple Siri, for example, are probably not the population who will suffer the most from climate change. So this kind of like dichotomy is a bit complicated. And I'll wrap up because I have a big red flashing thing here. But the last two things, education and research. We need to train people up and raise it, and that's really good to see it more and more being part of curriculums at graduate level and before. And research, because there's a lot we still don't understand about how to build all these tools and all these estimations methods. So cultural change, well, plugging in a paper Caroline put together, highlighting that we need cultural change, so do give it a read. And rebound effect is this thing, you make a tool 10 times more efficient, everyone uses it 100 times more, great for innovation, slightly less if the goal was to reduce electricity usage. So that's why we need to engage. And that's part of building a community, so we organized this conference, and I'm building this community of practice around sustainable computing now. So lots of people have joined. I will officially launch it soon. I'll put the QR code back during the Q&A. For now, it's just a Google form asking people. Everything I've talked about, it's on our website. Do check it out. And I'll end by thanking a million different people. Probably forgot many. And yeah, thanks.
So thanks, Loïc, for that excellent talk. Right, so I'm going to look first to the room to see whether I've got any questions in here. Yeah, just there.
Can we just put the QR code back on the screen, the slide back on the screen? Thanks.
Hi, it's very good, because we look quite a lot around on building the business cases for in the civil service world. We try to look into all those aspects of sustainability. My question is, you talked about cultural change, you talked about the learning and training people and creating that kind of knowledge. Looking back on the other hand, all the work to train them to have a cultural shift, you still have going to use the technology, the data, and everything. And then have ever been like that kind of an impact, how much you're going to use to actually train someone, and then that impact, but then what kind of a benefit it would give on the other side at the future. Has that been calculated? That has been modeled?
Yeah, it's an important point, quantifying the impact of the training step as well. So for example, the kind of thing we're working on is on-demand training resources being made available online. And the carbon cost of that is very minimal. I can decide not to use a GPU for a day, and I've probably made up for the carbon footprint of running that for the next year or so. So I would hope that it would be a no-brainer that training up people will benefit. But I completely agree. If the training initiatives start to be quite big, we need to think about that.
Any other questions in the room? Yep, one just about that.
Yeah, I think the microphone.
One of the things about cost is that you might have an intuitive idea of how much a project is going to cost. Do you think it's realistic to get to a point where, as well as having that kind of figure in your mind, you'd also have a figure in your mind for how much a project is going to cost in terms of carbon?
That's a really good question. I would like to, but I appreciate that it's really hard. And that was part of the motivation behind the online calculator, because you don't need to actually have run the experiment to use the online calculator. You can say, I think it will be about 200 GPU hours, and that gives you an estimate. Part of it is raising awareness. So what we do now is in our papers, we include a statement at the end where we acknowledge the carbon footprint of doing this analysis. And if that becomes more common practice, then I guess you can have a better idea, because in all the papers you'll have read in preparing for the project, they will all have a statement, and you'll realize that the order of magnitude for this kind of project is that much. So hopefully that can help, but yeah, it would be nice, but it's difficult.
Okay, so if there are no further questions, just say thank you again to Loïc for an excellent talk.